Hello everyone and welcome again to the Talk Africa Plus podcast. This week we focus on Mali, which has topped news headlines over the past 3 weeks due to a deadly conflict that has left more than 80 people dead. Sadly, the story of conflict does not begin 3 weeks ago. It's a culmination of what began as a local rebellion in the northern region over a decade ago, a rebellion that has since evolved into a regional conflict stretching across the Sahel. Our big question today: where next is Mali going? Of course, I'm Jerry Owili, and I'll be joined by Douglas Okwach, our senior editor for the weekly Talk Africa show.
Thank you, Jerry. It's been a pleasure.
And
always. Always.
And for the first time, we also have Matthias Muindi, who is our news desk planner here at CGTN Africa.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome, gentlemen. And I just want to let this conversation flow so that we get the gist of everything that is happening in Mali. It's the biggest talking point in Africa currently. A lot is happening in the country. Of course, there's still the rebels that the military government is trying to push back after they tried to take over Bamako. They succeeded in taking parts of Kidal and other satellite regions away from Bamako, but the situation is still very tense. Matthias, I just want to know, how do we get here?
When you look at Mali's political history, especially since the 1960s when it became independent, it has undergone what you can call a cyclical political curve. Because Mali started very well in 1960 when it became independent. They were under a civilian government. But unfortunately, this government mismanaged some of the local political issues, the economy, and by 1968, Mali had its first military coup. So the country would remain under military rule for the next 23 years. 1991 is when General Traore's government came to an end. But after that, they came up with a very, elaborate system in which Mali became actually one of the democratic success cases in Africa. The next 20 years, Mali was under good, political governments which were, civilian-led, elected, and they managed the country very well in terms of the economy, in terms of the various, political issues. However, things started going wrong around the turn of the new century. There are, questions about governance. There's mismanagement of tensions with the Tuareg, sentiment of autonomy in the north, finally led to, an outbreak of armed conflict. That is what would lead to the coup of March 2012. After that, Mali has been on basically a free fall ever since. And that's why we are in a situation whereby we are not just concerned about the end of conflict in Mali, but actually the stability of the country itself and the wider West Africa. So a mismanagement of, domestic politics and also the mismanagement of any armed conflict that had broken out in the country.
Mm-hmm. And the impacts, as you're saying there, are not limited to the borders, within the borders of Mali. It's something that stretches far.
The situation in Mali in terms of security goes beyond the country's borders. Currently, we are witnessing, first of all, two elements in terms of that threat. The first one is the Tuareg separatism in itself. The Tuaregs are not just found in Mali itself. They are also found across most of the Sahel, in Algeria, southern Algeria, western Niger, and the parts of Libya. So if the Tuaregs were to suddenly in Mali say we are going to have an independent state, that is something which is going to destabilize countries beyond Mali. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we have now militant groups that are operating in northern Mali. Jihadists allied to al-Qaeda, others allied to the Islamic State. These are groups which have transnational ambitions. If there is no way they are going to stop, even if they were to take power in Mali, it's unlikely they are going to stop in Mali. So the threat which is originating in Mali is just going beyond the country's borders and even beyond the Sahel. Mm-hmm. So whatever we do in Mali in terms of trying to manage this, we have to have regional considerations at the core of whatever decisions which has to be made when the conflict in Mali.
Mm-hmm. I've heard you mention a particular year there, 2012, but I just want us to go a little further than that. Yes. So just before 2012, something big happens in Libya, Douglas. Mm. And this is something that has implications that go even beyond Mali. Mm. Just take us through what happens with relation to that year, that particular year, 2011.
Thank you, Jerry. First of all, for our listeners who may, sometimes the idea of Africa can be very complex, very complicated. For our listeners who may not know where Mali is in Western Africa or West Africa. And Mali is surrounded by Algeria, which I think shares the longest border with Mali, and which, as Matthias here I will tell you, once mediated peace in that country. I think around 2018 or thereabouts, 2015, 2018 thereabouts. So there is Algeria, there is Mauritania, there is Senegal, which interestingly, I think at independence, Senegal and Mali were some kind of federation, which lasted a very short time. Then we have Guinea. Is this Guinea-Conakry? Then we have Cote d'Ivoire. Then we have Burkina Faso. Then we have Niger. Mali is a very large country. But now coming to your question, and Mali got independence in 1960. I think its first president was called Modibo Keita. Now coming to your question about what happened in 2011, I think this is where now the United States under Barack Obama gets accused of the events that led to the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, so-called Arab Spring earlier on, and the events that led to the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, and the U.S. involvement actually. And I think asked in an interview after he left the presidency, I think one of the things Barack Obama said was his biggest regret as president of the United States when it comes to Africa was Libya, because they know what they did there. So, of course, the destruction of Libya means now there was no state there. Libya collapsed. It became stateless. And all sorts of groups sprang up, vying for power, vying for control. And as Libya collapsed, state security collapsed along with the state itself. And there were very many arms, all sorts of arms, all sorts of groups, that were now operating in Libya. So this is the collapse of Libya has direct links to, the problems that then we see in Mali today, because again, Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, who had a relationship with the Tuareg. He was like a godfather of the Tuareg. And even some of these insurgents that they talk about now leading a secessionist movement, I understand, emerged from Libya, complete with arms and armaments that they crossed the border into Mali with. So the breakup of Libya created militant groups vying for power, and even the entry of others like al-Qaeda got into that vacuum. So this vacuum is what we can say, and the arms that were then in the hands of various groups that contributed to the problems we are seeing in Mali today, including the Tuareg. So the instability in Mali has a direct link to the collapse of Libya and then the groups that we saw there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And as you just captured it rightly, Libya is still divided to this day. There's, of course, the Tripoli-based Government of National Unity, and there's the Eastern-based side as well, which is affiliated, I think, with the section of the parliament. And to this day, they have never really found lasting peace. It's something that majority of the international players and some of the stakeholders in Northern Africa have really been trying to push for. But Douglas, so there is a chaotic scene in Libya. That's October 2011. And then now something big as well happens in 2012. In Mali now. And I think since 2012, as you're mentioning, it's been sort of a downhill trajectory for this country. So can we blame just the chaos in Libya, or are there other players that might also have been implicated here?
One of the things, actually, Douglas has captured it well, the collapse of the Libyan state following the military activity by NATO, led by the US and France especially. There is also a wider Western reason why the the instability in Libya and the Sahel would erupt it is. A decade or two before the Libyan conflict erupted, Western countries, especially led by America, had recruited a lot of foreign fighters to go and fight in in Afghanistan. Some of these fighters had come from North Africa. At the end of the first war in Afghanistan, when groups like al-Qaeda would later emerge, most of those foreign fighters were just abandoned and they had to go back somewhere. A lot of them came back to Algeria and North Africa. So when Libya is collapsing, you have a large group of people who have battlefield experience, who are also very disillusioned about, let's say, the current, political system, international order. So it was very easy for groups of armed fighters, especially from Algeria, to cross over into the rest of the Sahel and then start some of the insurgencies you see. That's how al-Qaeda gets in northern Mali. That's how al-Qaeda becomes part of the Sahel. So Western approaches to, let's say, the Sahel and the Mali specifically has been very fragmented, driven by national interests in which most times they don't care what happens to those territories. So when you have a NATO-led process in which Gaddafi ends up being overthrown and his government collapses and Libya becomes basically a very, very fragile, almost failed state, they didn't figure out what will happen to that. That Libya was one of the most well-armed countries in the world. Those weapons had to go somewhere, and some of these groups went and took those arms, and they have launched the campaigns you have seen in countries like Mali. There's also the element of the state in these countries like Mali. The state in Mali was already fragile. State building in some of the countries in Sahel, even after independence in the 1960s, had been very weak and it was very fragile. So when you have a government confronted by armed non-state actors with very powerful weapons, it was very easy for these states to basically collapse. So most of northern Mali became almost under the control of non-state actors, and that is a situation which has persisted to date. Now, you can ask yourself, we are almost doing 10 years since the coup of March of the coup of 2012. Why has this situation not been sorted out? It is because of the way international community has approached the situation in Mali. They don't try to understand the dynamics of the conflict which is playing in that country. They don't try to understand what are the reasons which are driving some of these groups to operate there. And most of the strategies which have been applied, including by powerful countries in the West, have ended up actually making the situation worse. Now, if you look at Mali as it is, basically it is on the risk of being abandoned by the international community. And if that was to come to pass and be left as it is, the implications would be very dire, not just for West Africa as a region, but also even beyond into countries which were once responsible for what has happened to Mali and the Sahel.
There's a question I still want us to tackle here. So these groups come into Mali from the larger Northern Africa region. And as you capture, there are people who already have battlefield experience. Yes. These are people who have probably lived years and years on the front lines. Yes. They don't know any other lifestyle. Yes. They're comfortable on the front lines. And so why do they pick Mali, one? And two, what is the reasoning that pushes them to now get into Mali and start engaging now the administration that was there at the time?
If you look at northern Mali, where the Tuaregs, that's their Tuareg heartland. For the most part of independent Mali's history, the Tuaregs always felt they were marginalized. So there was always the existence of a sentiment of marginalization by the government in Mali. So in that kind of a political and a social setup, you'll find a wide pool of people who are willing to take up an armed campaign against the state. The second thing is that you realize that after the end of the Algerian civil war in the late 90s, a large group of well-armed and well-trained people had been pushed out of Algeria's national territory. Most of them ended up in northern Mali. So you got people, especially of Tuareg extraction, who had fought, in campaigns in Afghanistan. They have come back to Algeria. They have been kicked out with their government. They have been pushed in northern Mali. So you realize two sentiments come about here. One, Tuareg separatist sentiment is already present. And then you have militant groups who have a very radical interpretation of Islam. They suddenly also join that lot. Suddenly Mali is confronted not just by the traditional complaints by Tuaregs of marginalization, but now you are dealing with transnational jihadist movements which do not recognize Western institutions which were already in place in Mali. So suddenly Mali has to fight on two fronts, and the situation in the capital itself was not very good in terms of the military strategy. So they mishandled that conflict. In 2012, they invited the French, who saved the government, but they actually sowed the seeds of what is happening at the moment.
And Douglas, there's also another question here that now is emerging, because of course there have been multiple military interventions that have been, launched with the sole aim of crushing these groups that have, as Matthias gives us that history very clearly, have been operating for all that while in Mali. None of these interventions have been successful. Some operations are actually still underway even now as we speak. But why do these mainstream efforts fail to make the impact that is desired for them?
Thank you, Jerry. That's a very good question, and it's a question everybody is talking about, is trying to find an answer for. I think the main approach of Western conflict intervention, if you look at all interventions from the West, whether they are from the United States, or whether they are from France, who have largely now been kicked out of West Africa, is to militarize a conflict. Militarization, it's the hardware, the idea that boots on the ground, guns and bombs will solve a conflict. I think they ignore the larger causes, the root causes of these conflicts. That is why largely, if you look at the French intervention in West Africa, the so-called Operation Saval and Barkhane, why they failed is the total militarization, the military approach to conflict resolution. It doesn't work. And of course, the idea that all the players, all the actors in the conflict are branded as armed groups, terrorists, in complete, they completely ignore the grievances some of these groups may be holding. So I think this has been the key weakness of these international interventions in Mali. Now, when you talk specifically about the UN, and Matthias here may elaborate further on that, I think the UN missions, like the one that was in Mali, has a mandate, which is clearly spelled out under UN guidelines on when you deploy UN forces, are they peacekeeping, or are they, what is the other term they use for them? Yes. So these peacekeeping missions are not peace enforcement, means they don't have the power to enforce. And sometimes this limits their mandate. And I think this is one of the reasons UN mandates in many African conflicts have not succeeded. So I think the idea that you militarize, the idea that you bring in the United Nations peacekeeping missions with limited mandates, the idea that you ignore local grievances, the idea that you brand everybody a jihadist, a terrorist, a militant, without actually trying to determine the cause of these conflicts, have largely played a part in undermining the interventions we have seen in Mali. And of course, I think also to a larger extent, if you look at the wider theater of the conflict, there are also geopolitical interests. France in particular had an interest in who leads Mali or who leads other former Francophone West African countries. And these interests sometimes clash with the general interest of the public, that sometimes it leads into what we call, imposing leadership on the local populace. So these cardinal principles of dealing with conflicts have been ignored. And sometimes even these things depend on mediation. We see how African conflicts are mediated. sometimes by external actors. And the question you ask then, what sort of leverage does this mediator have? Do they have credibility? And what sort of support, and I may put it this way, what sort of acceptance are they generally accepted? So even where mediators are brought in, if you look at the situation in Mali and even the intervention by Algeria, then which is far north and considered a Gulf, an Arab, belonging to the Arab coalition, and then you leave these other countries that neighbor Mali that are more of African origin, then that is problematic. Then the tension again also between Mali and the regional bloc ECOWAS did not help the situation very much. So you look at the intervention in terms of its militarization, the interventions in terms of how they ignore the local grievances, the interventions in terms of how they brand everybody, a rebel, a traitor, a terrorist, and even the UN mandates in terms of the limited, authority they have in dealing with these conflicts. So we have conflicts that have a continuous cycle in this part of Africa.
Mm. And to this day, Matthias, many analysts describe the Sahel as one of the world's fastest growing centers of extremist violence. And when you look at some of the incidents, such as the one that we witnessed, and it's still going on 2 weeks ago, of course, as these groups try to come and take over Bamako, they succeed in taking Kidal, they try to push the government out, they even kill a minister. And right now we know the president has taken up that role of the defense ministry because that defense minister was killed. When you look at such incidents, is there really hope that this trend could be reversed? Because the efforts are still ongoing, but we still see these incidents cropping up. Will this ever end?
When you look at, first of all, before I answer that, when you look at the state formation in most of the Sahel under the French colonial rule, because most of the Sahel was under French colonialism, state formation in those countries was pretty weak. The central authorities were mainly confined in the capital, and the state authority or influence was never beyond the main cities. So in these regions, if you look at northern Mali, if you look at even Niger itself, if you look at Burkina Faso, areas which were far from the capitals used to feel marginalized. So that element of marginalization remains predominant in the Sahel. And that is something which has not even been addressed, even after what we saw in Mali, whereby we had a large deployment of external forces, foreign forces fighting there. You have the UN peacekeepers, you have the French troops, you have American intelligence security forces operating there. All of those ones were just concerned with their own interests. So the original element of marginalization in the Sahel has never been addressed. And if that is not dealt with, it's going to continue being a driver of these instabilities. The other elements Douglas has touched on it is whereby a lot of these conflicts we see in the Sahel it's not one conflict. They are so multifaceted. If you were to just break down the conflict in Mali, it's just basically three main types of conflicts going on. One, we have an armed separatist campaign by the Tuaregs in the north. Mm-hmm. Then you have like this now the militant jihadist type coming out from groups like from al-Qaeda. Then you have local ethnic conflict also still going on, especially in the central regions of Mali. All of those different conflicts require different approaches, but we have tended to lump everything as one. And we tend to think the problem in Mali is counterterrorism. Counterterrorism will only deal with only one element. You can take out the jihadist movements, but you are not going to take out the Tuaregs. You are not going to take out the communities who are fighting one another. The issue of Mali, if we are to just focus on that, Mali has now to go beyond, they have to really, the current military-led government has to basically decide. The military option in this country has not worked for more than a decade. Can we now consider the issue of a political solution to this? It has been done before. It worked, but now there are setbacks. What am I talking about? In 2015, there was a peace agreement which was mediated by Algeria. It aimed to end the tensions between the central government in Mali and the Tuareg rebels. They ended up signing what is called the Algerian Accord, and that's how northern Mali was peaceful for for a couple of years. The political elite in Bamako, in Mali, later mismanaged that accord, and when the military government came back to power in 2023, they basically got rid of that agreement. So there is a history in Mali whereby you can get into political negotiations to first of all deal with the issues. Because if today the government, the central authorities in Mali, were to have a negotiated settlement with the Tuareg rebels, because the good thing is that the Tuareg rebels up to now, they have not talked about secession. They are talking about autonomy. If you can come up with a consensus, a political process in which they feel they are part of Mali, but in which they can administer some of their issues, it will be easier for you now to deal with external armed groups operating in Mali. We are talking about militant ones. We are talking about, anybody who just doesn't have interest of Mali at heart. So there is hope if we can start a process which is political, which tries to split all the various, instabilities in Mali, and then tries to address some of these. Otherwise, if we can persist on using a militaristic approach, we are going to be here for a very, very long time.
More recent analysis of the crisis in Mali tend to look probably at the terrorism era, the era that, say, starts around 2012. However, the earlier coups, the one that happened in 1968 and the one that happened in 1999, actually predate this era of terror. And earlier, the first coup that happened in Mali in 1968 was an ideological issue that led to the overthrow of Modibo Keïta. Then we have purely, 1990, 1991. Now, this is the so-called wave of democratization that sweeps not just across Africa, but some parts of Europe. We see the coming down of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of new states in Eastern Europe. In Africa, the push for democracy. In countries like Kenya, the push for multipartyism and constitutionalism. These are the things that led the pro-democracy move that led to the collapse, the coup in 1991. However, it gets more complex now with terror and these groups, running away from the vacuums in North Africa and entering Mali, including indigenous Malian groups like the Tuareg. So now we see more terror-oriented developments in these political changes we see in Mali. And the 2012 one, of course, is the failure to deal with the Tuareg insurrection. And then, of course, the mismanagement, like Matthias has already pointed out, of these jihadist insurgencies that then led to the coup in 2020. And then now we see another cycle. So it keeps happening in cycles, and the causes are as complex as Matthias puts it. All various levels of conflicts going on in one conflict.
So those are 4 coups that you count there?
Yes.
Since Mali got independence, right?
Yes.
So if you look at these 4 coups and the implications that they had, of course, in every instance, there have been very concerted efforts to try and just pacify the country and ensure there's stability, lasting peace, something that has not really been successful all across the board. And it is not, and I just want to say this, it's not because there has not been any effort. The efforts have been there, but they're not succeeding. Could we also point the finger to the people that are funding these other groups, the forces in the underworld that are trying to ensure that the status quo remains, because probably there's something that they benefit? So could we also point a finger at them and the agenda that they're trying to continue in Mali? And what could this agenda be, Matthias?
It is very clear, what you have spoken, Jerry, is true, because when you look at the groups which came from Algeria, and these are now, let's say, the forerunners of the, militant groups, they are jihadist groups operating in Mali. For them, some of them felt embittered. They thought they'd been mistreated by having volunteered, went and fight in Afghanistan for Western interests. They come back, their own governments don't want them. So there's that element, lingering sentiment of betrayal and mistreatment. Those are groups which are not going to make compromises, with the processes, to end the conflicts in Mali anytime soon. Those are also groups which are also, fueled by wider global, interest to fight the West, to fight other people who don't follow their ideology. So most of those groups are not going to enter into any political processes to negotiate with you. And of course, like when we talked about the collapse of the state in Libya, it allowed other groups to start operating. These are criminal groups which operate in the Sahel. The people who traffic weapons, the people who traffic, who are engaged in illegal migration, they traffic all manner, even narcotics coming from Latin America. So these are groups that are not interested in a stable Mali. These are groups that are not interested in any political processes to end that. So there are people whose full-time job is to make sure this instability cross, because you can ask yourself, Mali has been unstable for almost 15 years, but it has not disintegrated into a failed state. So these groups, whether they operate in northern Mali, whether they operate in the central regions, they make sure the territories they operate are stable to enable them to conduct whatever businesses they are, they are engaged in. So there, even if a political process was to be started to try to stabilize Mali, you are still going to face very, very serious challenges. And the other element you also have to ask yourself is, like Douglas pointed out, the number of coups that have taken place. We have had a wave of coups in West Africa in the last 5 years. Why is it that there was that wave of coups, and why these coups have not ended up solving the problems they promised to solve? You look at some of the people who have taken power in some of those countries, instead of addressing the core political or even security issues that brought them to power in the first place, they have ended up doing some, employing some policies that have actually made the situation worse. For example, in Mali, the government might be trying on a military front to fight its enemies, but it has also isolated a very large part of the Malian society by limiting political expression in the country. They have, banned political parties in the country. They have imposed restrictions on private media. They have imposed restrictions on civil society. So you realize people might want a secure Mali, but they are also realizing they are also being, their freedom of whatever expression they had is also being contained. So that has not done the military government in Mali any favors. And also, when you get into arrangements of having external security partners, you also need to ask yourself, what is it that these external security partners want? Mali traded off it, sent out the French out. It has engaged with other external security players, but that has not translated into a better security arrangement. So a lot of the security, partnerships, some of these governments are also entering the external players, might not be meeting Mali's current security needs. So we need to have a process whereby to recognize that even if we are pushing for a political process, we need to recognize the fact that there are some people who do not want Mali to be stable for other reasons, which I've elaborated earlier.
Yeah, Jerry, I think there are three things Matthias is saying there in terms of international interventions. Of course, he has spoken very well. You asked about resources, money, and who's benefiting and who's giving the money. Of course, we know there are benefits to human traffickers, drug dealers, weapons manufacturers. Conflict is business for people who make weapons manufacturers. But in terms of the groups that have operated in Mali, in terms of the search for peace, we have the Western approach, which didn't entertain dialogue. That is why every time you have a conversation about, but what about peace? Who's talking to who? Who's sitting around the table with who? You find very little information about that, because Western approach, the Western interventionist approach in Mali did not encourage dialogue. And of course, we know what in the end happened. It fueled anti-colonial sentiment. The French being kicked out, the Americans, we don't want foreigners here. Then, of course, the alternative approach, which have now brought in other players. Of course, there are many reports of abuses, going on in Mali at the moment. And this has triggered, local resentment by local people. Then the third one, of course, is the fragmented military forces that we see everywhere. There's a battalion here, there is another one here, there is another one there, each one of them with its own mandate and sphere of operation. So these things have created smaller spheres of operations in one country.
we want to expand on that. The humanitarian impact, it's massive. Of the continued conflict and wars that have been happening in Mali, different groups trying to battle different groups, probably the administration in the country. And so if you look at some of the figures that the UN is providing, there is a severe humanitarian crisis in Mali. And the UN says 6.4 million, that's nearly 30% of the population, is in urgent need of assistance. And this is this year, as you're speaking right now, mid-2026. And this is due to intensified fighting, insecurity, and this now is also compounded by climate shocks. Because remember, Mali as well largely lies in a region that is really not favored by the climate. And so the UN also says that more than 378,000 people are internally displaced, where violence continues to dodge them. And of course, there is widespread civilian casualties. Aid has been cut off. And remember, there have been international aid, especially from the US, has been reduced by the Trump administration. So there is a lot of struggle when you look at even response to the humanitarian impact. But now, whenever we see some of these things still going on, like the conflict that's going on now, with these rebels that have taken the town of Kidal, it only serves to probably cause more alarm, I would imagine, not just to Mali, but also to the international players who have been working to ensure that the civilians in Mali are protected and they can enjoy their lives in peace. And when you look at now the situation as it is, Matthias, and the figures that the UN is giving, shouldn't it then bother even more people, whether it's, regional blocs, whether it's continental bodies, the AU, the ECOWAS, such people, to try and bring in more efforts into, trying to solve the crisis in Mali?
Absolutely. The figures you have just, elaborate there, Jerry, are just, shocking. When you look at the way the international communities are, we are in a very, tragic situation, the way our international communities are approaching humanitarian situations in Africa. If you look at some of these reports, they just talk about the Sahel. There's no country called the Sahel. There are countries which are falling in the Sahel region, but they'll just group you with Sahel. So anybody in Senegal is as in the Sahel as in somebody in Mali. So you realize there's the element of, forgetfulness in terms of how bad the situation in Mali is. And when you look at what we have just discussed earlier in terms of the drivers of this conflict are so many, you need to seek to address one of them. You might currently be focusing on, doing counterterrorism operations, and you finish that part of the element. But Mali is also experienced conflict related to climate change. When you look at where the north meets the south, the conflicts which I had mentioned earlier of, communal conflict, some of them are driven by the fight over land, the issue, fight over water, fight over any other natural resources. That is another, driver of a humanitarian crisis. So you can have armed conflict, whether it's by Tuaregs or whether it's by jihadist groups, but which is also, generate a large part of those people who are being displaced. Then you also have people who are, related with because of because of climatic reasons. Mali is a landlocked country, very rich in natural resources, but in terms of economic growth, it's not one of the richest, even in Africa. No, so you find poverty levels are very, very high, and economic hardships are very prevalent. So when you have armed conflict, it is now driving socioeconomic, tensions, and so it becomes very easier for some of these armed groups to have a wider pool of people who they can recruit from, whether it's for the jihadist cause or whether it's for the Tuareg's cause. Mali's kind of volatile relationship with some of the neighboring countries has also not helped the situation. The reason is that many decades ago, they were what we call the richer countries in the western part of Africa. Countries like Ivory Coast, countries like the coastal countries like Ivory Coast, countries like Ghana, and countries like Benin. So a lot of people from the Sahelian states deeper in the Sahel, whether it's Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, used to go and get get employment opportunities in those countries. But because of tensions between the deeper Sahelian states of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso with the rest of the West Africa, a lot of those job opportunities have also dried up. So you have reduced remittances coming from those countries, and you also have, fewer people being allowed to go and work in those countries because of these tensions. So you realize the humanitarian situation in Mali is very, very dire, coming from different causes. The key thing is the key players of international community who are still interested in a universal, fair order, to keep on saying the conflict in Mali is as bad as the conflict in Gaza, or the conflict in Sudan, or the conflicts in countries like Afghanistan. We should not have one, like tiers of conflict whereby this humanitarian crisis in Gaza is more serious than what's happening in Mali. A life lost in Mali is the same as a life lost in Gaza. And when you look at the international forecast currently, it is not doing justice to what's happening in the countries like Mali and the rest of the Sahel, because yes, we generate these impressive, frightening statistical figures, but we are doing very little in terms of actually delivering humanitarian aid on the ground. We are doing very little in trying to support processes which will try to, limit the drivers of this instability. And of course, the policies which have come out from the US under the Trump administration have not done favors in terms of delivery of humanitarian aid. Right now, any people, including the UN, who are interested in delivering that aid, they are struggling with no lack of resources. So that has also made it very, very worse, very, very difficult for those people who are willing to go into Mali, deliver humanitarian aid. They say, we just don't have the resources, not because we don't want, but because the people who have traditionally supported these processes have decided that they have other things to focus on. And now we have a situation which is humanitarian. It's costing lives, it's causing misery, it's driving this instability. So we'll have to think of more creative ways of delivering and alleviating the humanitarian situation in Mali, but not relying on the traditional systems we have always relied for the last 50 or so years.
Jerry, just to add there on what Matthias is saying about Bamako, understandably, was under blockade. So I think what needs to happen to resolve, at least to ameliorate this humanitarian situation, probably is to open the humanitarian corridors. Of course, in situations like this, there are armed groups that are operating around or outside Bamako. In order to open these humanitarian groups, perhaps the Mali military, in concert with whatever assistance they are getting from other partners, need to look into the issue of opening these humanitarian corridors. Because if you don't open those corridors, food, medicine, and other essentials cannot get access, cannot reach the population that really need these things. So I think that is really key and urgent, how to find ways of working together, the Mali government and partners, how they can work together to open these humanitarian corridors. That's number one. And number two, I still think that there is a place always for the United Nations, regardless of what happened previously. We know Mali just had enough of MINUSMA and all these other foreign interventionist forces that were operating in the country. I think it is also important for the government to reconsider the place of multilateralism in solving conflicts, not just in Africa, but in the world. Therefore, I think this is an opportunity for the Mali government to reconsider, having minimal, return of some agencies like the UNHCR, the refugee agency, these agencies that deal with humanitarian crisis, to come back and operate in Mali to alleviate the situation. And of course, I still also think that the idea of the alliance of Sahel states, the AES, which brings together Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, we needed to have seen its manifestations in this conflict. So far, we haven't seen anything, whether it's in terms of putting together troops that can help enforce, minimal law and order in some of these places where it's become completely lawless. So where are the Sahel states in terms of rescuing Mali in its time of crisis? And I also still think, Jerry, that ECOWAS, regardless of the fallout, with these three Sahelian countries, still has a place as a regional body in looking at this crisis in Mali. Because only these joint efforts, Mali together with partners, ECOWAS, the alliance of Sahel states, can deal with this humanitarian crisis that we see unraveling in Mali today.
It's interesting you bring that aspect out because these are countries, the three of them, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. They're the ones that came out to form the Alliance of Sahelian States. And they quit ECOWAS formally in January 2025. And the reasoning was they felt they're better off together because at that point, they were these are the countries that had just undergone a military change of power, a military takeover of power. And ECOWAS had sort of asked them to cede power back to the civilians. And they decided, no, we're going to become one, and we're going to support each other militarily. And I remember when they formed the Sahelian, the AES, part of the reasoning that they gave was, part of the tenets of that formation was that they would support each other militarily. So it's actually surprising, even for me, Douglas, as you put it, that these other partners do not want to come and get involved in this. Matthias, why is that so?
When you look at the foundation of the Alliance of Sahelian States, when you look at the founding charter, a lot of the details and the clauses which were contained in that document, they were just contain a lot of things on politics, a lot of things on security. And of course, security was the most urgent issues because the biggest difference between these three Sahelian states of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and the rest of the ECOWAS, they differed on three fundamental issues. One was how to deal with the conflict that was destabilizing the Sahel. That was one of the biggest differences, the strategies which was going to be employed on that. The second difference was the transition to civilian rule. Yes, you have taken power because the security situation is bad. But when are you going to have a timetable to transition to civilian rule? And then the third element where they differed was the various human rights abuses which came, in that particular period. So when these three left the economic state or in ECOWAS in January last year, a lot of the objectives they were pursuing were very political and very security oriented. You would have expected that a year later, when Mali, the situation they found itself in April, they would be the first people to intervene in terms of, providing actually boots on the ground. What happened was that the Alliance of the Sahelian States, they issued a statement condemning the attacks which had happened in across Mali, but that's as far as they went. There were no troops that were deployed, and they made made claims that there were external players which were funding that attack. Where they might have some point there, but there's very little evidence which was provided. So you realize the Alliance of States had been founded on very strong political and security reasons, but when the biggest challenge came, I can say their performance was not all that very encouraging. The other element I would also discuss is, before I continue, is the element of humanitarian. Was that the three countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and Mali, they are all landlocked countries. Any delivery of humanitarian aid in those countries has to go through ECOWAS states. Most of them are the coastal states. So the government in Mali will have to make serious reconsideration, because if people in the international community decide we are going to deliver aid to you, it has to arrive at a port in a country maybe you have not very good relationships with. So the alliance of the events in Mali, tragic as they were on April 25th, tragic as they were, they offer an opportunity for the alliance of Sahel states and ECOWAS to look at what type of relationship are we going to have. Mali and the Burkina Faso and Niger might not want to go back to ECOWAS at the moment, but they'll realize that ECOWAS has a very key role to play here in terms of dealing with the humanitarian issues we are having here, provide us economic opportunities, among other things. But at the same time, the Sahelian state will also, ECOWAS also recognize these are independent states. They have the right to make sovereign decisions on which bloc they should align themselves with. Are there issues we need to respect about Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger? But what I can say is that the attacks of 25th of April is an opportunity now for ECOWAS and Alliance of Sahel states to sit down and say, can we work up on something which can benefit the populations which govern these areas? Because otherwise, the current situation is untenable. ECOWAS issued a very strong statement condemning the attacks in Mali, but that's as far as they went. Some ECOWAS states are in a position where they can even provide humanitarian assistance to Mali, but because of the tensions we have at the moment, they are like, no, we cannot do that because we don't have a framework in which some of these ones can be done. Mm-hmm. So the issue of alliance state is it has now to rise up from what has happened and to prove to its critics that they can actually go beyond very, grandiose statements, very impressive, policy documents, because the reality is that people are dying and the situation in the Sahel is not getting any better.
Though sadly, was it, I think in March, there was a forum that was held somewhere in West Africa, and the Sahelian states were very adamant. They're looking forward. They're not trying to get back into ECOWAS, even though ECOWAS was trying to tell them, you know what, you guys always have space here.
It is true. But when you look at one of the things which should be a wake-up call, even for the members of the Alliance of Sahelian State and also even the members of ECOWAS, is that who perpetrated the attack in Mali on 25th of April? It was a combination of two very distinct groups, which ideologically are not the best of partners. You have separatist groups and then you have transnational groups, militant groups. That tells you a lot, that if you don't make concessions, the benevolent groups which you are opposed to you, they might unite and you might be the loser. So right now, the Mali government is suddenly being confronted by an alliance made by militant groups and separatists. That's not a very, weak force. I have seen, reports indicating that some exiled Malian groups are even willing to talk to al-Qaeda types of groups with one sole purpose. We get the government in Mali out of power. That's not a situation not so many people would want to have. So if there is that kind of hardline position maintained by governments which rule some of these countries in the Sahel, especially in Mali, it is not going to make it easier for people to come up with a solution. And in most times, even if you refuse to negotiate somebody, you need to provide a solution. The solution you have provided so far, the military-led approach, has so far not worked. And your opponents are getting, the numbers is getting larger. They are uniting against you. We don't want to leave it until it's too late, whereby we have non-state actors who are too powerful, who take a state like as vast as Mali. So AIS countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, time is still on their side, in which they have to decide to reconsider some of the hardline positions they have maintained so far.
And Douglas brought something else as well, that bodies like the UN, like ECOWAS, still surely have a role to play in ending this conflict. But at the time MINUSMA was actually living, MINUSMA is the United Nations multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Mali. And it operated for about 10 years. It was one of, I think, the longest operating missions in that part of the world.
And that's short of the one in DR Congo.
Yes. And at the time they were leaving, because they completed their departure from the country on the 31st of December 2023. At that time, they had deployed more than 12,947 uniformed personnel. And to support this, they also had 1,786 civilian staff that had been deployed in Mali over that period. But sadly, it was also one of the deadliest missions the UN has ever had. Because you look at the figures that are given there, more than 300 peacekeepers rather, were killed in the duration of MINUSMA's lifeline. And those are big numbers. But can the UN then learn from that? And would it be willing to go back, even if Mali invited the UN back into its territory?
Well, that's a good question, Jerry. I think there are frameworks, under the African Union, under ECOWAS, under the United multilateral frameworks that admit, countries to these organizations. For example, ECOWAS has its own frameworks, like Matthias has already alluded to. The African Union has all its frameworks, and of course, the charter of democracy and elections spells out very clearly, when members can break the law and the sanctions that they then suffer. I think at the UN level, this is a matter that should come to the floor for discussion, the Mali crisis. Sometimes we fall short, as Africans in pushing our agenda. Of course, in one of the Talk Africa shows, I also learned that some of the UN General Assembly, in terms of conflicts, issues brought in for arbitration, actually come from Africa. So one can only hope that this Mali situation can find its way on the floor of the United Nations, so that it is discussed, it is debated, and recommendations and resolutions made on the case of Mali, because clearly the escalating humanitarian situation needs concerted efforts. You know, this is not something for Mali alone. It's a regional crisis. Then therefore calls for a regional response, calls for an African Union, a continental response, which I hear very little about, Matthias.
There's very little. There's very little.
I hear very little about. Yes.
No, there's very little which comes out from
Yes.
from the African Union, which is very sad, because when you look at Mali as a country, the war in Mali, it is the most devastating even compared to what we have in Sudan. When you look at the level of players, the Sudan conflict is very basic in terms of the adversaries here. It's just two security forces fighting one another. In Mali, you have so many groups with different agendas and with different origins, which are congregated in one national territory, and they are actually threatening the stability of the region. So what we need to do is, like Douglas has talked about, the UN, and especially the members who sit in the Security Council. The divisions which have been going on in the Security Council for a very long time are what has contributed to what we have in Mali. If they could just wake up and say, okay, let's just unite just for the sake of this country. Some of the other national interests we are pursuing in Mali, we can figure out how we can pursue that one. We can have a way of, trying to get some sort of semblance of a resolution, because the UN deployed one of the largest peacekeeping missions there. A lot of the troops Jerry has mentioned were killed in the northern regions where they were deployed to go and fight a different combat. UN troops don't go and fight counterterrorism. Most of them died in IED attacks. Those were planted by militant groups. So instead of deploying those troops to areas where they are fighting conflicts they are not really conversant, those troops should have been used to maybe pacify areas where they're just the usual armed conflicts, whether it's communal, whether it's just political violence. And then you can also use the same troops for, nation building. So the international community should not give up on Mali. They should actually look at where we have gone wrong. If it's the UN, they have to do their own soul searching, and they see how they can help, they can come back to Mali with clean hands. On the other hand, the Malian government, it might have had its own reasons to maybe push out external players. It brought in other external players who have not helped the country. So at the end of the day, it's the Malian who is in big problems here, threatening with matters of life and death. People have to make concessions at this particular time, because it's not who is right, who is wrong. It's a question of life and death in West Africa, especially in Mali.
And I see we're running out of time, but there's something that we can't really finish this without discussing this. Mali as a source of African heritage, African history, African literature, and the impact that conflict has had on that front with regards to Mali, and largely with regards to African artifacts, African literature, African, the ancient manuscripts. And it's really interesting because thousands of ancient manuscripts from the Timbuktu region were smuggled out of northern Mali to safety in 2012 after chaos erupted. And remember, the figures that were given were like 27,000 manuscripts found their way out of Mali. And that was, a lot of them actually were destroyed, and some of them they managed to recover, and they had to be kept outside Mali because of the conflict. And for 10 years, these manuscripts were outside the country, more than 10 years actually, because they were returned to Mali in August 2025. That's a total of 13 years of a country's history, the rich tradition and storyline of the country and of the continent lying somewhere else because of conflict. And now you look at this war again, starting again. Mali is still really, really a rich point of, if you want to tell Africa's story, if you want to tell the history of this continent, really Mali is a good place to start with. And if you want to still witness and experience the rich essence of being an African, Mali is really an important place for you to tell that story. Do we run a risk again with these conflicts that continue emerging of, Mali losing that heritage, Africa losing all these important manuscripts and artifacts again?
That's a very good question, Jerry, you have talked about, because when you look at the ways a lot of people focus on armed conflict, they tend to focus on various things: disruption of economic life, humanitarian crisis, the political instability which comes up. They rarely discuss about the culture or the impact on culture and heritage of a society by armed conflict. Mali, like when I started, I talked about was that Mali is an ancient, what we have in Mali is based on an empire which existed between 1230 and 1670, AD. That's about 800 years ago. And that, that library you have talked about in Timbuktu is something which is well documented throughout antiquity for the last 600, 700 years. That is an heritage you cannot replace. We have seen some of those manuscripts have been preserved, and we have seen some of the militant leaders who later got arrested. They were taken to some international courts in the at the Hague. They were tried, prosecuted for that. Crimes against humanity, crimes against, heritage and culture. What we also need to ask ourselves is that some of the manuscript and Mali's heritage was also smuggled out and has been sold to private, owners, some of them based in the West. One of the ways some of these people who benefited from the cultural heritage of Mali could try to even assist in sorting out the problem in Mali is to either return these, documents, or they have them, secured somewhere where they say, this is not our property. This is the heritage of the Malian people. Let us preserve it until the country is stable, but we'll return it. That is something which we need to see a campaign whereby people say there's a large part of the Malian history which has been taken out of the country, which is not benefiting certain people, but that country needs to have it back. Okay, so it's something which needs to really, that campaign has to also be brought about, even as you deal with the issues of stability, issues of ending the conflict.
So, Jerry, like Matthias has already alluded to, and you also indicated in your opening remarks there, is the epicenter. Mali is the epicenter of Africa's culture, heritage, literature. And what really shocked me about Mali around that time in 2012 were the things that went on in Timbuktu, where the devastation, and this was covered by international media, and it was really, really shocking news, the images, the pictures that you were seeing there. So the things that went on in Timbuktu, in places like JNIM, and of course in Bamako and Dogon country, where where this heritage and culture is stored. In places like Dogon, people were using pickaxes. I don't know which people are those to hack at, sculptures, ban literature. So it was really, really shocking. So the cultural loss, the heritage loss, the intellectual loss that Africa has suffered because of the things that have gone on in Mali need to be addressed. And I don't know whether, Matthias, organizations like UNESCO or even the United Nations again and its relevant arms can mobilize, what can be done to look at this question of stolen, looted, artifacts that now got into the wrong hands and their way into other foreign museums or private houses outside Africa. So the destruction in Mali was really, really shocking. Away from the conflict and the humanitarian crisis we are seeing, must be addressed, the question of the heritage of Mali. Yes.
Nice. Absolutely. UNESCO has attempted within its limited scope in terms of in some of the areas where there was destruction, they have said we have some resources. They have able to restore some, but there's a lot which still remains to have been, where it was left by the attackers. And what has been lacking are the private beneficiaries of the looting and the destruction of this heritage. Like you mentioned, there are museums, there are private collectors, there are all manner of traders in some of these cultural resources who are benefited, but they remain silent at the moment. So even as UNESCO tries to rehabilitate some sites in Mali, some of those people should either be held to accountable by their national governments or by any other transnational institutions that try to deal with issues of, cultural expropriation.
By the way, Matthias, just as you are concluding there, this year, I think, 2026 to 2030, is it 2026 to 2030, the African Union year of reparations?
Yes.
Where we have addressed issues like the transatlantic slave trade brought before the United Nations very successfully by Ghana. And of course, the recognition of it as one of the gravest crimes of against humanity. I think on the same note, this question of the destruction that went on in Mali should be brought to the floor of the United Nations, and the people who are responsible for it be brought to account. I mean, this heritage needs to be recovered. This program, this long program we have of almost 10 years of dealing with Africa's identity, Africa's past, you know, the things that make us African, that are no longer here, that are in other places. I think this is an important time that these issues should also be addressed.
Absolutely. Like we said, it's one of those campaigns whereby we want to deal with the most urgent issues, whether it's stabilizing the country, whether it's ending the humanitarian crisis. But we should not forget, Mali had a very, very proud history, which went to thousands of years. It should not be lost in the fog of history because certain people don't want to bring it on the table. If we are discussing reparations and restitution in Africa, let's not talk about things which happened during the colonial period. Let's discuss even that expropriation that has just happened in the last 10, 15 years. We are talking about Mali. We have talked about Sudan. I'm sure other armed conflict in Africa, we have similar stories. That's an aspect of conflict resolution that needs to also to be addressed.
Very well. So finally, as we wrap up, I just want to ask one question to both of you. And in a very brief manner, what next for Mali? What next?
I think for me, in terms to Mali, is the warring groups which are involved in Mali. Each one of them has to maybe look at themselves in the mirror and make a serious concession. And also the international community, much as they are pursuing diverse interests in Mali, they need to recognize that this country cannot be left as it is. It's a situation which is untenable.
Douglas?
Thank you, Jerry. Not my views really, but the views of experts and analysts who watch Mali, who analyze Mali, like Matthias here, that one of the things that country needs to address is the question of interest groups, like the Tuareg. Can the idea of autonomy, like we see in other federalism, work in Mali? Can that idea work? Then number two, dialogue. In the last Talk Africa show we did, a Malian on the show said that dialogue at home, Malians speaking to Malians themselves, is one of the ways that these problems can be solved. So then also the re-engagement, like I already stated, the re-engagement of regional organizations like the ECOWAS, and of course the realization, of the AES, ECOWAS, the African Union needs to be taken into account. So that's really, really important. So for me, those are the ways in which progress can be achieved in Mali. Think about these groups and think about federalism. Think about restoring Mali's relationship with regional groups, continental bodies, the United Nations. All these have a part to play in the recovery of Mali. And most importantly, this process must be driven by the Malian people themselves.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. That has been very insightful for me, and I'm also sure for our audience, our listeners as well. Douglas, our senior editor here for the weekly Talk Africa show. And for the first time, Matthias, we hope you enjoyed it.
It was a great.
Our news planning editor here at CGTN Africa. But even before I leave you, I just want to remind you of our other podcast. That's the China Africa Talk, our weekly podcast dedicated to bringing a better understanding of what is happening on the African continent and in China, both from an African and a Chinese perspective. Here, you pick up news, views, and discussions on what is happening between China and Africa pertaining to diplomatic, trade, and economic engagements, as well as social and cultural relations. You can only catch these and more only when you tune in to China Africa Talk. Of course, I'm Jerry O'Willy, and it's always a pleasure having you on board Talk Africa Plus. We will catch you next time.